bring this issue before the people of Pennsylvania. Senator said he is the prime sponsor for Senate Bill 3, the primary bill which passed the Senate by a 40-7 vote earlier this year, and is the primary discussion point for the Pennsylvania legislature. Next, we're going to bring up Ryan West of Greenbrier Treatment Centers. He's a publicized expert on the subject of workplace drug and alcohol addiction, including a specialized article on cannabis use in the workplace. So, Ryan.
I learned my lesson from Senator Fulmer. He said he was nervous. I'm a lowly corporate trainer that has to follow a state senator. So I'm also not as well spoken, so I did have a script. Thank you very much for having me here tonight and having Greenbrier represent this very important public forum. My name is Ryan West. I'm an admissions counselor, also a corporate trainer for Greenbrier Treatment Center. Greenbrier is a behavioral health subsidiary of Washington Health System. We're located all across southwestern Pennsylvania. We have inpatients, we have a detox facility, we have outpatient rehabs, we have halfway houses for both men and female. I've worked in the addictions field now on and off for about 8 years. I've experienced drug addiction both personally as an admissions counselor, as I said, as a friend, as a family member, and also as a loss prevention specialist in the corporate sector. I've taught and continue to teach drug and alcohol addiction and also drug and alcohol policies and best practices for various companies and local businesses. As a student of ethical and scientific psychological practices, the debate about medical marijuana, it seems, arises not so much from the science of medicine as it does from our culture, our history, conflicting personal values, and politics. In short, I think some people feel that the general standards and rigorous evaluative processes for approved pharmacotherapies in America are largely being sidestepped. In 2008, the American College of Physicians assumed a neutral position on cannabis use, as many people do, stating that it is neither devoid of potentially harmful effects nor universally effective. To break this neutrality and the neutral stance of many people, a dispassionate scientific analysis must tip the scales. All of this being said, I am not here tonight to necessarily argue for or against the legalization of medical marijuana per se, as the plant clearly contains many compounds that may prove useful for therapeutic indications. It may also contain compounds that have no therapeutic benefit, or some they may actually harm the user. I am here, however, to present the facts as I have viewed them from my experiential lens and to share my personal story as an active practitioner in the field of chemical dependency treatment, where I directly work with those suffering from various substance abuse conditions, including marijuana abuse and dependency. Senator Fulmer mentioned it very early in his speech. He mentioned the term gateway drug, and I think that's an important place to start. I do think we need to specify what that term means, because most people, when they think of cannabis or marijuana, they think of the gateway drug. A lot of people believe it to be absolute, that if you use marijuana, you will use harder, more dangerous, immediate dangerous illicit drugs. That absolute statement is absolutely not true. I am comfortable, however, stating that marijuana use in any capacity increases the user's statistical risk of trying other illicit substances. In fact, its use has clearly been associated with a user's increased risk for both abuse and dependence on other illicit drugs. There's a survey every year called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It's the largest survey sponsored by SAMHSA, a governmental entity, whereby they go in over 60,000 households and they poll people on their substance use. This is the largest sample that we have for analyzing drug trends in America. it is very clear that there is an associated risk that people who use cannabis or smoke marijuana tend to use more other illicit substances. It is also the most common drug that treatment providers see pop up on pre-employment drug screens and post-accident drug screens in the companies they work with. Does this mean that every recreational user of marijuana or medicinal user of marijuana will end up addicted and in rehab? Absolutely not. But like all addictive substances, marijuana hijacks areas of the brain and our own natural chemicals that are responsible for rewarding us for our behavior and grossly amplifies them. Through repeated use, and in contrast to what some users report, a variety of withdrawal symptoms can be experienced by the frequent and heavy user, such as anxiety, appetite loss, weight loss, restlessness, sleep disturbances, irritability, physical cravings, and psychological urges. I haven't just read these statistics, as I just did to you now, in a journal article or research paper. I, along with my peers who work at Greenbrier, have witnessed and continue to witness these withdrawal symptoms firsthand from real people, just like the people sitting in this room today. Marijuana use is also linked to self-medication, addiction, and mental illnesses in at least some, if not a greater significance of populations, especially for adolescents. During puberty, the effects of smoked cannabis are generally more intense and longer lived than seen in adults. An adolescent's brain undergoes significant changes, particularly in areas where behavior has been implicated. The developing brain may be extremely susceptible to the adverse effects of external cannabinoid use, regardless if the use is medical or recreational. Adolescent cannabis use is also associated with depression and anxiety disorders that may emerge later in the user's life. In fact, it has been said that individuals with anxiety disorders who use marijuana, alcohol, or other illicit substances, who self-medicate, are up to 5 times more likely to develop substance dependency disorders than those who do not self-medicate. For the estimated 10% of marijuana users who become addicted, an intense desire to smoke often interferes with interpersonal and occupational advancement. To provide a real-life example to these statements, I'd like to quickly tell a story of a male patient I admitted to inpatient rehab whose primary diagnosis was cannabis dependence alone. To protect confidentiality, identifying information has been altered, but the core of the story remains. The patient's name was Michael. Michael was an avid pot user who began smoking at the early age of 13. He used socially with his friends at first, primarily on weekends, sometimes after school if it was available. His perception was that marijuana was a harmless drug with no immediate or long-term consequences. This so-called harmless drug, a harmless pattern of use, eventually led a likable friend, father of 3 children, husband to a very kind and supportive wife, to completely spiral out of control in his mid-30s. Michael's grades in high school slipped his last 2 years, and he didn't get into the college he wanted. His grades in college were also subpar, at least compared to the 4.0 grades he had in high school or in junior high and middle school. At the age of 21, the usually happy-go-lucky junior fell into a deep depression. Instead of seeking help, Michael began to self-medicate his feelings with increased marijuana use, which, looking back, he admitted just numbed him further. In his mid-20s, he met his future wife and married her quickly. By the time he was 35, he had 3 children under the age of 8. Shortly after his wedding, Michael began experiencing severe mood swings. A year later, he sought professional help and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Michael decided to up his dose and frequency of marijuana to help stabilize his symptoms, but they only got worse over time. By his 35th birthday, he noticed the time gap between his cycles of mania and depression narrow from every 2 weeks to hourly. His behaviors were erratic, his mood fluctuated rapidly, his work performance began to suffer, and his home life spiraled out of control. It got to the point where his wife threatened to leave and divorce him and actually take the children with her. He then lost his job due to performance issues, got a DUI and a possession charge for wrecking into a guardrail while high. The incident itself cost him his license and a heavy fine. So the stress of his marriage, the loss of his job, and now the legal fines that were way too much for him to handle, Michael decided to again up his dose of daily cannabis use in fear and panic of what was to come in his life. 2 days later, severely depressed, Michael threatened to take his life. It was at this point that luckily his family convinced him to pick up the phone and call Greenbrier for help. 2 weeks after Michael's last hit of marijuana, he experienced what he called a life-changing turnaround. His mood was stabilized again. He felt calmer and could think more clearly. 4 weeks after his last hit, Michael continually commented in outpatient treatment that he was a new man, feeling better than ever, completely free of marijuana use. Now, this is a story based on true facts, and it is a story we see time and time again at Greenbrier. Do we treat heroin addicts? Yes. Do we treat cocaine addicts? Yes. Do we treat alcoholics? Yes. Do we treat those dependent on marijuana? Absolutely yes. In Michael's case, what you may have already noticed is that he started using at a very young age and continued to use marijuana despite all of the adverse consequences in his life. Consequences he learned in treatment that were caused not just by his desire to self-medicate, but his desire to get high. These repeated behaviors, despite negative consequences, are all too common a trait among the substance-using and dependent populations. The true linchpin that separates those who are merely physically or psychologically dependent. In conclusion, marijuana's label as a wonder drug, a one-hit fixes all approach, is based mostly on anecdotal testimonies of actual users, case studies and self-report surveys, and the push for the medical use of marijuana at the state level seems to be driven largely by compassionate considerations of lawmakers instead of dispassionate scientific inquiry. There cannot be compassionate scientific analysis without involving some level of bias, and bias of any kind is not welcome in the double-blind clinical trials that every FDA-approved drug in America today has undergone. It has been said that the keystone for medical decision-making is not risk, for no treatment is without risk, but balancing of risk and benefits. Any rational consideration of legalizing medical marijuana should thus include both sides of the equation. Again, I'm not saying that the chemical constituents or components of the marijuana plant do not have potentially therapeutic indications. It seems that many in fact do. What I am saying is that the marijuana's almost 3,000 years of documented cultivation and use as a natural herb and its potential harm to the user should not give it the right to be grandfathered into mainstream medicine, bypassing our evidence-based system that is designed to both promote and protect the health of U.S. citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for being here tonight and for sharing those stories from Greenbrier Treatment Centers and all of that excellent information you gave. Next, I want to bring up Michael Palladini from Pyramid Health. Michael is a registered pharmacist who has developed training materials focused on prescription drug abuse and marijuana use and abuse. Michael?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. My name is Mike, currently a business development and community relations representative and corporate trainer for Pyramid Healthcare, a substance abuse treatment provider throughout Pennsylvania and various other states. I've worked concurrently in pharmacy since the late 80s, been a certified addictions counselor for the past dozen years. So I like to spend a lot of time in that area where the pharmaceutical world and the substance abuse world interact, and that can be a very interesting place at times. Frustrating as well, sometimes dangerous, but interesting nonetheless. I've developed trainings regarding prescription drug abuse over the years, and last year the certification board approached me to develop and present a training on marijuana. Just a general overview, I was asked, because they assumed it was too complex of a topic to cover in 3 hours. And after doing a bit of research for a couple weeks, I got back to them and I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's going to take a lot of information to get through this and condense it down to just 3 hours of discussion. But being the motivated person that I am, I accepted their challenge, put it together, and really expanded my knowledge on the chemical nature, the pharmacology, where cannabis, as the senator correctly referred to the medication as, where it stands now. To go back a bit, in 1851, there was a department formed in this country called the Bureau of Chemistry, which was responsible for listing approved medications for use by physicians in this country. And pharmacopoeias, lists of accepted medicines, exist throughout the world for many, many centuries. And in 1851, cannabis was included on the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And it was for a while, all the way until 1942, when the Bureau of Chemistry morphed through its several years as the FDIA, or the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, which only lasted a couple years. They got rid of the insecticide. Now we just have the FDA. And in 1942, after all of the parts of the marijuana plant were made illegal in this country, they pulled cannabis from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia against the wishes of the AMA, or the American Medical Association. So in 1942, here we've got an illegal substance that doctors are no longer allowed to use against their better wishes. So we fast forward decades to where we are now, and through the 70s, through the 80s, 90s, there has been research going on in other parts of the world by pharmaceutical laboratories, chemists employed by pharmaceutical manufacturers in other parts of the country. And I don't want to get into all the legals. Someone else may, according to the Controlled Substance Act, about where we stand with marijuana and cannabis as a controlled substance and the difficulty in getting it to do research on in this country, which is starting to ease up. The FDA, as we hold in high esteem as the gatekeeper of all of our medications, has to put that approval on a drug through clinical trials to make that drug acceptable for physicians to use in our medical world. Currently, and as an example, I looked up some anticonvulsant medications. Since the Compassionate Care Acts in many states kind of originated through formulations that have been created to assist young people who have seizure disorders that are not being remedied by what medications we have currently. These anticonvulsant medications, and it's a long list, but I've got phenobarbital, valproic acid or Depakote, Dilantin or phenytoin, Tegretol, Felbamate, Lamictal, a variety of drugs. Now we use gabapentin or Neurontin. All these medications are tried to control seizure disorders, we'll say in children. There's something that the FDA requires a drug manufacturer to list with their medications, and that's called a black box warning. And in studying and reviewing a lot of information out there, not only in the anticonvulsant category, but in our opiate medications, there are a lot of black box warnings out there. not most, but a large percentage of the drugs approved by the FDA contain a black box warning. And what a black box warning means is that in the literature that's provided to physicians and patients, this information is in a box, it's boldly printed in black so you don't miss it. The anticonvulsant meds used for seizure disorders in children have black box warnings of cardiac arrhythmias, agranulocytosis, skin rashes, dizziness, aplastic anemia, hepatotoxicity or liver disease, CNS impairment, pancreatitis, and so forth. They are not without their dangers. A lot of children go through each of the medications until one of them may work without the incidence of side effects, or they may not work at all, and then they're left with what do we do now? Currently, and just listening to some of the other speakers, when we talk about a substance, a chemical, a drug like what marijuana or what cannabis provides, there are 400 plus cannabinoid-like chemicals within the plant, as well as a variety of other chemicals. It is an extremely complex chemical organism. Not only that, it's extremely complex socially, economically, legally. There are a lot of hands getting around this type of momentum now. And I like to say that the gold rush in this country is never over. This is providing a gold rush of sorts in many areas. So there's a lot of things to be aware of. There's a lot of things to look out for. And just for your sake, if you're going to look into this issue, be aware of all of these different areas that this drug is prominent throughout. But as far as the medication goes, there are two major components within the plant itself, THC and CBD, tetrahydrocannabinol or cannabidiol. And for years, all of the research was focused on THC.